Disputes Decoded with me, Chris Campbell. This is an ArbTech podcast series where we will take a deep dive into a variety of legal tech issues by way of candid interviews with selected subject matter experts. Technology has, and always will, have a profound impact on dispute resolution. And in this series, we'll give you insights into where we're going next. We will demystify complex concepts, decode the jargon, and provide practical insights on advancements across the legal tech space. Join us as we navigate this future where law and tech converge. Welcome to Disputes Decoded, where we download the field of arbitration into the future. Hello there, and welcome back to Disputes Decoded, an ArbTech audio initiative. I am your guest host, Chris Campbell, from my podcast, Tales of the Tribunal, and thank you for coming back to download some more information with us. Before we get into today's episode, a small and humble request. Please share the show with a friend or colleague. And if you really want to show your support, leave us a comment or review on your podcasting platform of choice. It helps others find the show, and it helps us out too. So then, we last left off in the midst of a conversation with Racheal Muldoon and Ferdinando Samaria on AI regulation and application generally, especially in the financial industry, but especially the legal industry in the commercial spaces. We'll continue that conversation, this time by taking a further look at proposed regulations, some specific impacts on the financial industry, and some thoughts on how regulators can be proactive in this conversation and help retain talent. It's a fun conversation, so strap right back in and let's get back to it. I'll be here to close out on the other side of the show. Turning back to, the practice of law, and in particular, dispute resolution mechanisms, and especially international arbitration, I wonder if you see any particular impacts, maybe advantages or disadvantages to the deployment of AI, anything that maybe you've seen or you could imagine seeing here in the near future.
Yeah, well, it's a fascinating area, as I'm sure many people logging into this podcast have at the forefront of their mind if they practice in the arbitration space. What does this technology mean for the arena? Now, I've had the benefit in recent weeks of meeting fantastic experts in the field. One, for instance, a lady from Colombia. And some of your listeners might know that Colombia is truly at the forefront of the implementation of AI in judicial proceedings in order to achieve efficiencies, because the world over, there are delays with court hearings, delays with handing down of judgments. But we've also heard, as has been alluded to, the difficulty of relying on certain Gen AI models that I shan't name for the reason of hallucination and bias and the like. So it's reaching that balance. In addition to Colombia, I've also spoken with experts in Belgium, and the universities there are doing amazing things with models, looking at arbitration proceedings, which I'm involved with. Again, not to hand down decisions and hand down judgments, not to categorically set fines or anything like or final determinations in cases, but instead in the initial, say, disclosure phases, looking through evidence. My work previously at the Serious Fraud Office in London involved an awful lot of wading through disclosures, discovery, as you call it in the US. And it takes up a significant amount of our time in the court's time making various orders. Well, if there can be more sophisticated models than the current software, I believe the software is called relativity or autonomy, then that can only be good. But I caveat everything with there has to be a human-centric approach with that appropriate oversight. You cannot let the model run its course and be blindly adhered to.
Ferdinando, any comments that you would add there?
I think certain aspects of the power of computational ability that AI brings to the table are highly compatible with certain disciplines, and I think law is definitely one. Machines can acquire enormous databases of information and process them extremely efficiently. And very often law is about, looking at legal cases from the past and bringing the relevant ones to the table. You can get fantastic support from a well-designed machine in that sense, which with the adequate human supervision can probably generate fairly powerful and useful results.
Sure. I mean, I think at least in some of the approaches that we've seen in some countries, you see this concern in particular of how AI might be deployed against either fact finders, the tribunals, the judiciary, and the like, because essentially one could imagine a situation where through the combination of AI and machine learning, you might be able to, not only upload the entire body of law, but the decisions or awards rendered by a certain judge or certain tribunal. And you could essentially take the lawyering out of it to the extent that, yes, it has human oversight, but you're essentially just quoting a judge back to a judge about their previous words. I wonder if there's anything that gives you pause for either of you in sort of thinking through those types of possibilities.
Yeah, I draw comfort from the fact, or rather the hope, not the fact, that I won't be out of a job as a barrister. I can stick on my wig and gown and go in front of a judge. And by all means, I can refer to previous judgments, and they, of course, provide guidance in a common law legal system such as the UK, where part of our body of law is made up of previous decisions, and consistently applying that can be automated to an extent, I accept. But there needs to be an element of creativity there in order to develop the law and develop the common law. And for the time being, until you have true sentience and that ability in the models, humans can step in and provide that creative flair that might benefit a client in court.
And if I interpret your point, Chris, I mean, clearly AI can maliciously modify facts and events to play in a certain direction, and it can actually do so to the extent that with new technologies, I can probably deep fake pretty much anything I want. So that clearly gives rise to a set of worries, because some of these things might have consequences. Having said that, technology could probably come to our rescue and help, because using essentially digital signatures and making sure that all information is properly signed, and this brings us back to the crypto world that we mentioned before, ultimately you will always be able to certify the origins of information. So you can have something that plays out an entirely fictitious and an event that never took place that looks so amazingly real, but through layers of digital signatures, you will be able to establish whether that was generated by some program or indeed was obtained in some other way. And that should ultimately help making sure that there is a filter, and a filter where humans can still play a part.
As we're coming towards, I guess, the back portion of this conversation, I wonder, we've talked about so many topics here. I mean, I think, again, there are many different rabbit trails we could follow with any of them. Suppose you've got a genie or a magic wand that, could grant, whatever you would do, and if you were trying to control regulations of AI across the globe, and I'll leave it open-ended so whoever wants to take it first can. What would you do if you could change something, I guess, either overnight or in that sort of magical fashion?
Goodness. I'll give it a go. What would I do? Well, I'm a fan of the EU AI Act. I think it's the best that we have for the time being. Certainly better than nothing. I would say it's a comprehensive framework. It's been in draft or in contemplation for over 12 years. It's been in draft for over 6 years. The UK initially had involvement with that process before we decided to leave the EU, which is regretful. But what would I want if I could wave my wand or ask the genie? I would want certainty, because my clients, corporate clients, come to me and say, Racheal, we love the UK, we love London, we want to open up our headquarters here, and we need your guidance with that. But what's on the horizon? What's going to happen in the next 6, 12, 18 months? And I say, well, if I'm a betting woman, I would say that we're going to have a change in government. We'll copy and paste the EU AI Act and call it, you guessed it, the UK AI Act. We might change the odd detail. We might have more assistance for startups, for instance. There might be broader scope for regulatory sandboxes. They might even reduce the fine in some attempt to make this a competitive jurisdiction, when in fact, realistically speaking, the market for the time being is very much centered on Silicon Valley and China. That is what I would want. I would want something akin to the EU AI Act, so that we could have that certainty, because engaging with industry as I do, unusually for my line of work, but that's the only way I learn, going on stage, speaking to those providers, those startups, those SMEs, they just need to know what's on the horizon. It's not a case of we think prohibiting some practices is a negative thing. Far from it. They say, well, if we need legitimacy as an industry, then we need to have uniformity in terms of not having models that a totalitarian regime may produce to control the public's thinking. So that is what I want. I want to see a consistent approach, or as consistent approach as possible, to these are the minimum standards. We're going to set the rules of the game before it gets out of hand and before we find ourselves in the midst of another scandal, as we've seen with FTX.
From my point of view, let's see. The first thing I would do is choose the most attractive and wonderful headquarter to put the regulator in. So if indeed we're going with the EU framework, I would probably ask for a wing of the Versailles Palace in Paris, and we kit it out with the latest technology to make it really incredibly attractive, which indirectly leads me to then making sure that you provide the entity with enough budget to attract, as we said earlier, the best people, and indeed, in my opinion, pay them on par with industry, which should not be impossible, because for every many thousand of industry employees, there's only one regulator. And so the ratio is such that it might be a per capita cost that might look challenging, but in fact, overall, is not impossible. And so make sure that we get the best people. But then ultimately, and we touched upon this earlier, artificial intelligence and technology in general is sort of allergic to geographical and political boundaries. It's something that does not recognize any of that. And I think we need to, because we're talking about EU framework, we mentioned what the UK might do, the US moving in a certain way, or indeed China and other jurisdictions. In reality, we should have a global approach to this. We should have something where there is coordination. And because ultimately, a lot of the regulation will actually require implementing things, there should be almost a notion of having, how can I call it, something like digital commons, where there's going to be a lot of technological infrastructure which is made available to all participants to make sure that by coordinating and putting best resources at work from pretty much anywhere, we're able to provide the correct regulatory framework. So that would be my sort of wish and desire for my genie.
And if I could just tie that together, I think the initial tentative steps towards making these visions a reality are there. You know, if you look throughout all of those jurisdictions, both the principles-based and the rules-based, one thing underpins them, and that thing is agreement on the basic principles of AI governance. And they tend to mirror, as I said earlier, the OECD's principles for AI, you know, explainability, transparency, fairness. That is as common a standard as we have at the moment, which could be put on a legislative footing in the global arena, more than just signing a declaration of intent, more than just having a standardization process. I think that would be the starting point, and it's perfectly achieved.
What do we think about the likelihood of any of these things coming to pass? And, you know, as I listen, you know, certainly someone that is perhaps not as steeped in it, well, certainly not as steeped in it as either of you. That's what comes to mind, is that it sounds like there's a demand for regulation, merely if no other reason, just to make sure that corporations are able to operate so that consumers are protected and so that the world can continue to turn in sort of at least a predictable fashion, not just in a chaotic one. You know, I think, I guess, as we're talking about our final thoughts, final comments here, I wonder, we've talked about a number of topics here today. What final thoughts, comments, questions might you have on regulation in AI more broadly? And I probably will have a follow-up maybe there or two on what you say, but at least want to start us thinking about what should folks come away from this conversation thinking about in terms of regulation of AI and AI tools?
I will start with a sort of provocative statement, which is that a lot of AI actually doesn't work. I think we've mentioned crypto as an alternative complex world, but crypto, which is extremely complex, has the advantage of being totally deterministic. The technology is completely understood. You write code and it works exactly as you expect it. And there is barring errors in the programming and bugs, there is no uncertainty on the outcome. A lot of the AI is very tentative, is very experimental. And in many cases, it actually doesn't work. So to a certain extent, regulating a field that is incomplete in that respect is going to create even more complexity. Then there is an aspect of AI which is very delicate, which is linked to, in general, national security and the military. So, I mean, Racheal, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that the EU law actually excludes military applications, which I think is a very interesting caveat because, you know, to be honest, they are actually very, very, very significant. And so excluding them is kind of like opens a gap, which is, in my opinion, quite substantial.
I mean, because the immediate question would then be, okay, well, then can't we just term everything as military and, you know, sort of get around those uses?
Well, actually, it's interesting because whenever Racheal mentioned explainability earlier, and explainability is a very, very important part of any AI process, because especially when you're looking at output critical applications, then if something goes wrong, you want to know exactly what happened. And I always list financial investment as being one of them, medical as being one of them, and of course, military. Now, we're learning that one of these three central applications, very critical and delicate applications, is going to be excluded from regulation. You know, it's kind of, I think it's interesting. I think it's interesting indeed.
Couldn't agree more. I think it's, as you say, Ferdy, we're in a state of flux at the moment. There's been this unprecedented adoption of the use of Gen AI models by the public. It's captured the public's imagination the world over. But as you and I know, these models are far from resolved. They rely on, in some instances, rather dubious data sets that include fairly horrendous material in some instances, whether that be terrorist-derived or child pornography material, and that's being weeded out slowly. There's also the issue of bias. We don't want a future society where these models are perpetuating bias that we've already had for hundreds, if not thousands of years as a race. We don't want that. We're all trying to grapple with, you know, is this a novel thing that I can use in the day to generate an interesting blurb to start my speech with on stage? We've all been to events, we've all heard the podcast where they read a bit of prose and then they say, well, guess what? This was generated by, you guessed it, ChatGPT. And is the novelty of that wearing off? Are we actually looking for reliable utility from Gen AI? You've had lawyers utilize it and come under immense criticism. You've had judges utilize the outputs. As it happens, actually, only on the 12th of December here in the UK, we had judicial guidance for judges utilizing AI, and it promoted several things that maybe listeners want to think about. It's really AI literacy, understanding how is it that these models actually work? Where are they? What are they relying upon? Do you have sight of data sanitization practices by the data set providers? Has it been subjected to scrutiny? Does the data set include copyright protected material? And then we're into a whole other space of all of these class actions that are being brought the world over, but mostly in the US, by the likes of design houses and photography studios and huge publishers and actors, for instance, and authors. You know, is the output anything that I could actually own myself, or is it itself infringing or in some way irresponsible? So AI literacy is really at the heart of this, but rightly so. Also security, as you say. You know, one needs to ensure, for instance, on a personal level, that I don't upload confidential client information into such a model, because at the end of the day, I'm not satisfied by the provider's privacy policy that they're not retaining all of that data and utilizing it for some God knows what purpose, probably reselling it on. And so it's just being mindful of the fact that this hasn't just come out of nowhere, that these models aren't magic. They're not necessarily properly thought out from a compliance point of view, far from it. I think what will happen is in the next 6 years, lawyers such as myself will be kept tremendously busy because in most instances, these models are illegally producing outputs and encouraging the infringement of rights, the breach of privacy, and a whole host of data protection issues.
And the proliferation of lawsuits that have popped up across the United States, exactly asking those questions. And I think the U.S. isn't an island in that respect. I think you'll see those across borders, across blocks, across industries. And it's just really, as people understand what these machines and what these algorithms are capable of, they will say, oh, wait, I've got a claim.
Exactly right. Exactly right.
As it always happens in these types of conversations, the time is zoomed by. We find ourselves here at the end of our time together. A couple of closing questions. These are more sort of housekeeping, we'll call them, before we let our listeners go. If they want to follow your work, and maybe this question goes to you first, Ferdy, how can they follow you, the things that you write about, things that you talk about, your appearances, any of those types of things? Where can folks do that?
I would probably say if you look up some of the social media platforms or specifically on LinkedIn, you will find useful references and contact points. And that's probably the best I would suggest.
How about you, Racheal?
Yeah, same here. LinkedIn, I'm rarely not on it, although maybe for my holiday next week, you never know, I might take a break. But you can search me, Racheal, Racheal, Echo Alpha Lima, which was misspelled on my birth certificate. So there's only one of me, so I should be easy to find.
Nothing wrong with lawyering from the beach, Racheal. Final thought. Any shout outs to the folks listening at home, any colleagues, organizations, anyone you want to say hello to?
But perhaps I would say one thing that I always say, especially if anybody in a position of influencing education curricula at national level is listening. I think we all agree that this is a very important area. It's a very challenging area, and it's one that needs to be addressed and will form a substantial part of society development in the next few years. I think at national curriculum level, computer science, which is essentially the discipline that sits behind all this, is not being studied sufficiently. I think there is no computer science at primary school. At secondary school, it's very difficult to find computer sciences courses. Pre-university, you may be able to go to some colleges that do offer computer science. And so in most countries, the earliest opportunity to do it properly is university, which I'm afraid is too late. I think these will form a substantial part of literacy going forward. And so in the same way that we expect people to have basic understanding of mathematics and language, I think computer science should be literally on par.
You don't necessarily have to give a really inspiring statement like that too, Racheal, but anything like in that vein that you want to say, or any shout outs or folks hellos you want to say?
I'm afraid I'm not even going to try and compete with that. But what I will say, a shameless plug-in, I'm about to kick off very soon a tech, let's say, arbitration as the sole arbitrator. So anyone wants to reach out to me and ask me about, in the broad sense, the kind of tech subject matter in the arbitration space, and just let's say that you feel you've been affected by AI, but you're not entirely sure, or you don't know where to turn to seek advice, then let's have a chat.
Fantastic. Well, look, thank you both so much. It's been a pleasure chatting with you. It's always difficult having this conversation. What it means is that I have to sort of go back and re-listen at least a couple of times because I can't take notes as easily in the middle of the session. But I've learned so much. Thank you both for being here. Thank you to my guests, Racheal Muldoon and Dr. Ferdinando Samaria. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
And there you have it, folks. In the blink of an eye, we are at the end of our conversation on regulation of AI and its impact on various industries. A big thank you and tip of the cap to both Racheal and Ferdy for having such an important and interesting conversation, and for having it in such a way that made it easy, digestible, and approachable for those who follow the topic and newcomers alike. We hope you enjoyed this conversation and that we've presented a compelling reason for you to come back again for our next discussion with two guests who will reveal soon enough. Ooh, foreshadowing, exciting. If you enjoyed this interview, let us know about it via LinkedIn or drop us an email. And if you want to know more about ArbTech and its initiatives, head on over to the ArbTech website. One final note here. My show, Tales of the Tribunal, is back in action with our weekly news coverage, Disputes Digest, on the podcast feed and with our content over on LinkedIn. We have some fun things we're working on, some good irons in the fire, and we'd love to see you over there. In any case, that's it for now. Thank you for hanging out with us, and we look forward to downloading with you again sometime soon. This has been Disputes Decoded.